Today we continue our series that we're doing on the promise. We're looking at the life of Abraham. And today I'm entitling this sermon, Impatience. Not that any of us would know anything about that, right? Everybody here is very patient, and I'm thrilled about that. But impatience is a thing that, well, honestly, we all have trouble with. But we're not the first ones. And so we're going to look at that today in this life of Abram and Sarai. Their names have not been changed yet until they have their son Isaac, and then they become Abraham and Sarah are the names. What their names are changed to. But faith is a distinguishing mark of the Christian. Did you know that Christians were called believers before they were called Christians? And so we often feel like the good works we do are the distinguishing mark, but that's a side effect, or that is a result of us believing in God and being children of God. The distinguishing thing about Christianity is believing. And so Abram is important to us because he is the father of all who believe, according to Romans chapter 4. And so now, as we go through the story today, our story shifts this morning from Abram, the husband, to focus on Sarai, his wife. And for the first time in Scripture, at least, we hear from Sarai. I mean, who knew she could speak? She'd been quiet through this whole thing in Scripture, and now we get to hear from her. So even though we're going to focus on the women today, never take your eyes off of Abram, because he is the one the promise was given to, the chosen one. He is the one whom the promise was given. And so more than once in this story of Genesis, when we think about it, the pressure builds to a point of an explosion. It's family, right? And sometimes the pressure just builds. And so this is one of those times that we're going to be looking at today. Let's start with verse 1 of chapter 16. We're going to read 16 verses of Genesis. Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to have children. Since she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar, Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from giving birth, so go to my servant. Maybe she will provide me with children." Abram did just as Sarai said. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took her Egyptian servant Hagar and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when she realized that she was pregnant, she no longer respected her mistress. Sarai said to Abram, "This harassment is your fault. I allowed you to embrace my servant, but when she realized she was pregnant, I lost her respect. Let the Lord decide who is right, you or me." Abram said to Sarai, "Since she's your servant, do whatever you wish to her." So Sarai treated her harshly, and she ran away from Sarai. The Lord's messenger found Hagar at a spring in the desert, the spring on the road to Shur, this would be on the way to Egypt, and said, "Hagar, Sarai's servant, where did you come from and where are you going?" It's interesting that he knows her name and knows where she's really from, but asks anyway, "Where are you going and where are you from?" And she said, "From Sarai, my mistress. I'm running away." And the Lord's messenger said to her, "Go back to your mistress, put up with her harsh treatment of you." The Lord's messenger also said to her, "I will give you many children, so many they can't be counted." The Lord's messenger said to her, "You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You will name him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard about your harsh treatment. He will be a wild mule of a man. He will fight everyone, and they will fight him. He will live at odds with all of his relatives." Hagar named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi," because she said, "Can I still see after he saw me?" Or another way this has been translated is, "the one who sees me." Therefore, that well is called Bel Lahai. It's the well between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar gave birth to a son for Abram, and Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael for Abram. So the first words that came through my fingers, I was sitting at the computer after I read this, 3 words: what a mess, right? What a mess. I mean, there are 5 characters in this story, in this part of the story of the promise, but really this is a story today about 2 women. In a world that's dominated by men, here are 2 women with very, very different roles in this ancient patriarchal society, and both find themselves in deep despair for totally different reasons. But God had promised Abram more children than the stars in the sky above. And this is the mother of all promises. This is the best thing in the world in that society. But 10 years after that, he's 75 when he's promised that. And 10 years later, Sarai is still not pregnant, his wife. So the first time we hear Sarai speak in Scripture, she complains about her infertility. And she says, "Lord, the Lord has kept me from giving birth." But let's stop to consider the role of women in this patriarchal culture, because that makes a lot of difference in our story today. See, a woman's worth and significance came in the family that she could provide for that family. If a woman was unable to provide children and family, then in that society they often considered that she had failed at life. With no avenues for a career outside of the home, she was seen to have little value in her own eyes, and also outside of the home, others would see her as having little value as well. And then you add on top of this, in this society, the promise to her husband, Abram, that he would have more children than you could ever count, or as many as the stars in the sky, if you could count them. And she felt the pressure that she was unable to deliver on the promise God had made her husband. And so at some point she decided it was her fault. So 10 years go by after the promise of their family that would affect the family. This is a family that would affect all the families of the world, was the promise that God gave. And still there's no child. Now he's 85, she's 75. And so somewhere in the midst of waiting on God for 10 years. Now remember, they're inside the promised land. They're in the area of Canaan. So they're there where God had given them the land. But in that time, those 10 years, long 10 years I would assume, she concluded that the infertility was irreversible and that God really needed her help. God needed her to help him out. So she's just thinking, well, what if Abram was to have a child with her servant Hagar? Nothing could go wrong with that, right? So Sarah puts this plan into action, and I'm guessing without checking with God to make sure it's all a part of his plan, but she decides this is what she's going to do. And so at his wife's suggestion, Abram and Hagar had relations with one another, and she becomes pregnant. And Hagar's pregnancy, of course, causes a rift between the 2 women of our story today. Now, in one way, Sarai is in a superior position to Hagar, but it seems that as soon as Abram looks at Hagar, she gets pregnant. It's just like he just looked her way and suddenly she's expecting. But it did say that Abram did take Hagar as his wife, and so there was that relationship as well. So then what happens is Sarai is very frustrated, and so she blames Abram, right? Sarah tells her husband shortly after Hagar's baby bump appears that she's no longer respected. And so the whole thing boomeranged in a way that apparently Sarai didn't see. We would think that maybe she should have seen that, but she didn't. And so Sarai, in today's society, would wake up every morning, checks her Instagram, and every morning it's a brand new picture of Hagar standing in front of the mirror, showing the baby bump, how it's growing, and how proud she is to be one that can have a child. And this goes on every single morning, reminding Sarai that it's her husband's baby. What can go wrong with not following God's plan? Everything. So can you imagine what that felt like from Sarai's standpoint? And so she starts treating Hagar harshly. So Sarai's motives may have been good. I would give her that. She was sacrificial. She was willing to do whatever so that Abram's promise, or God's promise to Abram, could take place. But she clearly acted wrong, and so she hurt herself because she robbed herself, I believe, of the privilege that God was giving her. And I think the other thing is that Sarai did not understand how special she was to God. She didn't consider her true worth, and in the end, she's downplaying God's ability. See, here's the thing. She started listening more to society than to God because God puts value in every single one of us. But society said, you don't have as much value because you are a female and you can't have children, and so your value is so low it doesn't even hardly reach the scale at all. But yet, that's where she's thinking, and she's following what their society was saying instead of listening to God, who gives value to all of us. And I want to say at this point that I think a critical part of this story is that she glanced at the promise, but what happened was over those 10 years, apparently she was focused on the problem. She glanced at she glanced at the promise. This is God's promise. It's my fault that it's not working out. And so she starts thinking about my fault. I'm the bad person. I can't do what I'm supposed to do. And so she starts thinking about the problem, and that becomes her focus. And just honestly, Abram doesn't come off too well in this episode of the story either, right? I mean, if you're keeping track of Abram, you know that God introduced himself to Abram. God commands him to go to the promised land. But after they get there, it's the promised land. They leave almost immediately and go down into Egypt. And then after lying to the Pharaoh, saying that his wife is just a sister and she takes him to be one of his wives, then that all gets a messy. Go back and read 13, 14, 15. There's pretty good stories in those chapters of Genesis. But then Abram arrives back home to the promised land finally, and part of what they've picked up with all of their family and the wealth and all that are some servants, we'll call them, and so they're servants that they come back with them. And they come back with his nephew Lot, and now Lot is kind of a little bit of a wild hair, so Lot gets himself kidnapped. So then during this process, Abram rounds up a posse of 318 fighting men. These are his own servants. These are just part of the people who serve his family, and with his animals and all that he had, his flocks. 318 fighting men, and they're so good that they go and they defeat 3 different kings and their armies to get Lot back, to rescue Lot. Or 4 kings, instead of 3. And then during that process, he meets with this mysterious Melchizedek, and that's where the whole idea of the tithe that we get now comes from, was it says that Abram paid a tithe or a tenth of everything he had to Melchizedek, which is a picture of God. Or could have been God in person, I don't know. But God promises Abram a huge family, 13 different times in Genesis. And so this is who Abram is. He's a tough man. He can defeat 4 kings. He can rescue people. He's done all the things. He's traveled the known world. And so this man who chased these 4 kings 120 miles, whipped their tails in Damascus, is the same man who, when he got home, said, when Sarai comes up with this idea, he says, "Whatever you want, sweetie. Whatever you say." So I wonder if this story would have had less heartache if maybe one of them, maybe Abram, would have stood up and said, I know you're feeling a lot of pressure because you can't have children, and God has promised us a family like you wouldn't believe, more than the stars. I know there's pressure. I know that, and I know we're getting pretty old. I know that you're 75 and I'm 85, and it just doesn't seem like it's going to be possible now. But he could have said, but I love you anyway, Sarai, and I'm absolutely sure of what God told me. And I think it's a bad idea to help God out. I think we just need to let God work. But Abram didn't do that. So I think he comes up a little bit short on this one as well. So the second woman in our story today is Hagar. Now, who is the maid? She's a maidservant, and so she's an inferior role compared to Sarai, who is her mistress, if you will. And so again, this is a story of struggle between these two women, Hagar and Sarai. So Hagar is under the authority of Sarai. Matter of fact, she's really Sarai's property. We don't use the word slave much today, but that's really, if you were going to look at it, that's what she would be. She's Sarai's property. She has no personal rights. And even though Sarai disrespected Hagar, after she becomes pregnant with Abraham's baby, God still did not disrespect Hagar. Where Sarai wants to treat her as nothing more than just a baby-making machine for her husband, God sees Hagar as a person. When Hagar runs away, she's going back to Egypt, where they picked her up, they bought her, whatever it would have been, in Egypt. As she's running back to Egypt, runs into this angel or messenger of God, and it visits her on the way to Egypt. And surprisingly, I catch this every time I read this story. It just really stood out to me, I guess, this time when I was reading through this in preparation last week. Surprisingly, instead of helping this young woman get to her homeland where there be freedom from slavery and mistreatment, the angel turns Hagar around and sends her right back to Sarai. And Scripture says to Sarai, and the mistreatment. But with that comes a promise. Now, God doesn't make a lot of promises to women. He does to Mary in the New Testament. But there's not a lot of women that God makes promises to because they were a patriarchal society. But here, he gives Hagar a promise or a blessing. He says that she would be a woman who had an offspring that cannot even be counted. And then something else happens, one of one in the Bible, and that Hagar gives God a different name, a name that explains who he was to her through his messenger. He says, "You're El Roi." Now, El is God or deity, and then the Roi means who sees me. So here is a God who sees me in all the mess, sees me being harassed, sees me being mistreated, sees me having somebody else's husband's baby, and I have no choice in it. God sees me in all of this. Now, I think this might be a good time for us to stop just a second and remind ourselves that God defends those who are oppressed by others. We say it again. God defends those who are oppressed by others. And I think as we reflect God's love and light, we ought to make sure that we're working toward that as well. And so Hagar is the first person of all the 48 who encounter an angel of the Lord, as it says. She's the first. She's also the first woman in the Bible to God directly makes this promise or blesses. Hagar and Ishmael may not be carriers of the promise, which is the blessing to all the other families of the world, but God still blesses them. But let me remind you quickly, while we're talking about all the good things for Hagar, remember that Hagar is not an innocent victim either, okay? So God doesn't just bless the good people, and when we make a mistake from time to time, God doesn't throw us away. Okay, God blesses her even though she's not innocent. She did disrespect her mistress Sarai. I don't know to what extent, but she did. So here's the thing. How does all this play out for us? Maybe you have been Hagar. Or maybe you've been Ishmael. Maybe your pregnancy wasn't celebrated right away. Or maybe you were a son or a daughter who was born into a situation that's a lot less than ideal. Maybe it's really tough. Maybe others, as you've grown, have kicked you out of their club. Maybe others have made you feel like an outcast, even in your own home or in your own community. But here's what we can remember, what we can learn from this story, is that God is a God who hears and sees you. God is a God who hears and sees you. Whatever your circumstance, whatever issue it is that doesn't work well for you, God sees you. That's what that term that she names God, El Roi, R-O-I, means God who sees you. If you're Hagar, if you're an Ishmael, or maybe you're a Sarai who desperately wanted children but couldn't, and so you thought less of yourself, or you felt that others looked down on you because of that. Remember, God is a God who sees you. He sees you, where you're at, the mess you're in, with all the warts, all the sins, and everything. God sees you and cares for you right there. You see, whatever the circumstance, God knows and loves you dearly. He really does. It's good as it gets. Abram and Sarai, as I close, Abram and Sarai decided that they'd help God out. They decided they'd hurry God up. But here's the thing. When we try to correct God's direction, or when we try to improve on God's timing, we always mess things up. Always. Now, it doesn't mean that God won't work with the mess that's made, that God can't work through that and make things turn out for the good. He says He will. But here's the thing. It's always less hurtful. And we would always be better off doing things God's way instead of trying to improve on God's plan. We can't do it. God's plan is right, it's perfect for you, and God's always on time. And so I think that from this story of these women in a patriarchal society, so different, yet both hurting so much, I think there's a life lesson we can learn in this. It's this. When problems arise, glance at the problem. We don't run from things. Glance at the problem, but stay focused on God's promise. 10 years, Sarai did the opposite. But the life lesson is this. When problems arise, glance at the problem, know what's going on, but really stay focused on God's promise. Would you pray with me?